Hey everyone, welcome to the Temur Warp Midrange recap video. By now I posted up a few matches displaying the different features of Temur Warp Midrange. I hope you enjoyed them. I really enjoyed playing this deck, I have to say. And before I get to the different matchup analysis, I want to go through some of the changes I made to the different card makeups of the deck as I played with it and as I put in more and more matches and repetition with it. And I just want to share with you what those changes were. Of course, it would make sense for you to watch the deck tech on this particular deck before watching this recap video, because it would just make a lot more sense overall. I'm not going to necessarily explain to you what each card does. I'll put a link in the description, and there'll be a link to the deck tech at the end of this video as well, so stay tuned for that. But if we're looking at the core, the main changes here are that I actually took Jace out of Temur Warp Midrange. I found that focusing on Renin 6 and Tamiyo solely made a lot more sense. These two cards are really the cards that are going to be able to abuse Time Warp in their own ways, and I just want to increase the chances of me drawing into them or drawing multiples of them, if in case they get removed, or if you purposefully, -3 on Tamiyo a couple of times to kill her off, to get your Time Warps back from your graveyard. So that's why I decided to just up my numbers and cut Jace altogether. If we're moving to the threats, not much changed here except that I cut €1, so I was running 3 before, I'm down to 2, and that was more to make room for other changes I made in the deck. I really feel that €2 are more than enough. You're drawing into plenty of threats thanks to Time Warp. Thanks to Time Warp and thanks to Tamiyo as well. So I feel that 2 is enough, and we don't need to be super threat heavy all the time because we have more, we have more ample removal as well in the Temur colors. So that was pretty much it in terms of making room for cards. Now I want to go over the matches. So as usual in these recap videos, I go through the main categories of types of decks you will come across in most formats, but in particular Modern, because that's the format that I focus on the most. So let's start with combo. Well, we do have a permission package in this deck. It's not very substantial compared to the Simic version. So we're running 4 remands, but that's not, it's not as much permission as I would want if I was playing against a combo deck. So if you are playing a combo heavy meta, or you need to be combo cognizant, then I would suggest, potentially packing either mainboard or sideboard permission a lot more than what I have at least displayed here. Against Primeval Titan or Titan decks or Amulet decks, you don't really need the permission more than you need land disruption. I should say. And artifact removal. That's your way of slowing your opponents down, and again, you just need a couple of free turns and attacking in, and you're good. If you feel like you're coming up against these decks a lot more, then I would modify your sideboard accordingly. Put in some Aether Gusts, or change your makeup of Blood Moons. I of course run Blood Moons in this deck in the sideboard because you can. So why wouldn't you? But yeah, that's really going to be your call. I'm not necessarily sure that this deck is the best against combo, but you could definitely work it out. Moving on to aggro, I think aggro, you're doing pretty good here. I played quite a bit of aggro decks, and yeah, you have Lightning Bolt, you have removal, you have a Braid in the sideboard, or many other removal options in the sideboard. So I feel like aggro decks are going to have a bit of problem. They're going to have a bit of trouble getting through your Tarmogoyfs and your Euros. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about aggro decks. I think they're a relatively good matchup. You also have ice-fang Coatl, which will, ideally have Death Touch by turn 3. So, your opponents are going to be more weary about attacking in because they don't want to necessarily lose their good beaters. So I think aggro is a relatively good matchup, actually. And again, getting in those free turns will finish off aggro pretty quick. Big mana decks. So, as usual, Temur doesn't always do too well against big mana decks. You're going to be leaning heavily on your sideboard, bringing in Ceremonious Rejection, bringing in Blood Moon, bringing in, you know, Dismember potentially if you're in Eldrazi heavy meta. It's really, again going to be a meta call for you. The main board could be adjusted. I don't see where necessarily. You might want to change Remands for something a bit more permanent in terms of removal, but I feel like, you know, I think again big mana decks are going to come down to your sideboard. You could probably win out some, you know, game ones against big mana decks like you know, Tron, but it's going to be more of a sideboard game. It's going to be more of a sideboard match, I should say. Not Magic, yeah. As usual, again in Temur colors, this deck will do okay in once you get to your sideboard. Game one, especially when they have the nuts draws, you know, it's going to be kind of hard to keep up. You do have removal, you do have big creatures, your Temur Warps will get big pretty quickly. You do have ice-fang Coatl to kind of chump block for you and send their creatures back to their graveyard, which is not a big deal for non-magic decks, but you know, you have ways to stall out your opponent to ideally get your Tamiyo or your Wrenn and 6 in place to get those Time Warps working. But I don't think Dredge is necessarily the best matchup. I don't think it's a good matchup in general when you're playing Temur in Modern. Just, you know, keep that in mind. Again, if you feel like you're going to be coming up against Dredge a lot, pack more Graveyard Hate. But I usually always pack Graveyard Hate irrespective of the meta. And I would suggest that you do as well. Control. Yeah, I think Control we have slightly better matchups here. Again, you probably want to bring in some more permission cards from the sideboard when you're playing against control decks, but I feel like we're doing pretty good here. We have our man to kind of, you know, delay our opponents a bit. We have creatures that are going to be able to put pressure, and we have ample amounts of them. And again, once we stick Tamiyo down, you know, we can start playing our Time Warps, and really, you know, once our opponent's tapped out, they're tapped out. There's only so many counter spells they can keep up. Now, control decks do run Force of Negation, which you're gonna have to keep in mind. So having a Time Warp, force, you know, negated essentially, is gonna be a bit of a problem for you. And again, if you feel like you're gonna be in a control heavy deck, a control heavy meta, you might want to adjust your main board or your sideboard accordingly. I wouldn't say control matchups are the best matchups. I wouldn't say they're the worst. Probably somewhere in the middle. It really depends on how used you are to the deck. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily want to be playing a control matchup, but I feel like you could. Last but not least, other mid-range decks. I feel here, again, relatively well placed against other mid-range decks. They're trying to do more or less the same thing, except not abusing Time Warp. You are trying to abuse Time Warp. So getting in those extra turns really makes a difference, even early on, before you have like kind of a soft lock with Tamiyo or Wrenn. You know, you can cause enough disruption with those mid-range decks, and you know, you can keep up as well with your relatively big creatures. If you feel like your meta is really mid-range heavy, I would actually increase your Euro numbers, you know, or play a bit more, you know, removal in the main board, just to shore up your win percentages. But again, as usual, it's always going to come down to the sideboard. The main board is truly sculpted to be, you know, the most efficient possible to abusing Time Warp. So you have to keep that in mind if you're playing a Time Warp deck. So before I end the video, I want to make one mention of a spoiler in Zendikar Rising, which is Morog, Fury of Akum. This card is really cool in a deck that is abusing Time Warps. I'm not 100% sure yet. Obviously, I haven't been able to test it. 50% of me says that this feels more like a win more card than anything else in a deck like this. And it is 6 mana, which we have to keep in mind, but you can get to 6 mana relatively easily in this deck. I feel like Morog, Fury of Akum will actually reduce the amount of times you need to cast Time Warp to win the game. Because, you know, if you have a Morog on the battlefield and you're Time Warping once, that's actually probably 2 turns that you're getting for your 1 Time Warp. Because, you know, again, you're more or less winning because you are getting extra battle phases while your opponent is tapped out. And that's what you're doing with Time Warps. What Morog is allowing you to do is have essentially a Time Warp within a Time Warp. It's kind of like, I don't know, Time Warp Inception here. Because odds are with Wrenn and 6 or just your fetches in general, you're going to be able to trigger the landfall ability, and you're going to be able to get an extra attack phase. and in some special, Christmas Land Miracle, situations, you can probably get maybe 2 extra combat phases in a turn. So that is pretty intense. If you can do that and then have an extra turn on top of that, you're winning the game way quicker. So I guess I'm almost definitely going to test out Morog, even though I'm going to be moving on to another deck next week. I'm going to be testing it out to see if any number above 0 makes sense in the main, and what I would cut in its place. And yeah, I think maybe a 1 of or a 2 of would be more than enough. It is a legendary creature, so you don't want to necessarily draw too many of these. But a 1 of might even be enough to just kind of increase your chances of winning, game 1s and even game 2s and game 3s. So I just want to make a shout out there, because I obviously didn't have a chance to play it and show it on my channel. So yeah, that's the recap for Temur Warp Midrange. I really enjoyed playing this deck. I also enjoyed playing the Simic version. I'm going to be posting a recap today as well. I don't know if I'm going to be posting this before the Simic one or vice versa, whatever. They all are going to go up on the same day within a few hours of each other, so stay tuned for that. Give this deck a shot. I think you're going to actually enjoy it a lot. I had really good win percentage with it, and I feel like if you play it and get used to it, you're going to really enjoy it as well. Stay tuned. Next week I have new deck techs coming up for a new set of decks I'll be playing for the next 2 weeks. And yeah, of course, more foiled videos, more everything videos. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you enjoy my content in general, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, follow me on Twitter, do all those things. You have no idea how much it really, really helps me out. And, my Patreon account is growing as well, which I really, really appreciate. I enjoy all of your support, monetary or not. I'm loving the comments, everything, so keep that up as well. Thanks, and have a good one.